In this episode, we begin with a reality check that helps beginners stop treating vulnerability management like a once-a-year event and start seeing it as a steady habit that keeps systems from quietly becoming unsafe. A vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited, and in payment environments, those weaknesses matter because attackers do not need a dramatic breakthrough when small, known flaws can open a path toward the cardholder data environment, CDE. The phrase continuously without blind spots is important because the real danger is not simply having vulnerabilities, since every environment has them, but failing to notice them in certain places or failing to address them fast enough to reduce risk. Beginners often picture vulnerability management as scanning and patching, but it is better understood as a cycle of discovering what you have, identifying what is risky, prioritizing fixes, verifying improvements, and repeating the cycle as the environment changes. When you can explain this cycle and why blind spots appear, you can answer exam questions with confidence and also understand why security teams emphasize discipline over occasional bursts of effort. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong foundation is understanding what vulnerability management is trying to accomplish, because people sometimes confuse it with general, keeping systems updated. Vulnerability management is a structured practice that aims to reduce the window of opportunity where known weaknesses can be exploited. It includes discovering vulnerabilities through assessment, deciding which ones matter most based on exposure and impact, and ensuring that remediation actually occurs and does not introduce new problems. In a PCI context, the goal is to prevent vulnerabilities from becoming entry points into sensitive systems or connected to systems that could impact the CDE. Vulnerability management also supports compliance evidence because it shows you are actively maintaining security, not just setting it up once. Beginners often focus on the idea of patches, but not all vulnerabilities are fixed by patches. Some are addressed by configuration changes, access restrictions, or architectural adjustments that reduce exposure. The core idea is that vulnerabilities are predictable, recurring, and often publicly known. So ignoring them is like leaving windows open in a neighborhood where people check doors every night. Continuous management means you close the windows as part of normal life, not only after you notice something was stolen. To run vulnerability management without blind spots, you first need a reliable understanding of your environment, because you cannot manage vulnerabilities on systems you do not know exist. This is why asset inventory and scope clarity are so important, even though they sound administrative. If a system is part of the CDE, connected to it, or could impact it, that system must be included in the vulnerability management story, because compromise there could lead to sensitive data exposure. Blind spots often appear when environments grow quickly, when teams deploy new systems without security involvement, or when legacy systems are forgotten because they still work. They also appear in cloud and service provider contexts where responsibility is shared and where visibility can be limited if governance is weak. Beginners sometimes assume the environment is what they can see easily, but attackers search for what defenders forgot, because forgotten systems are often unpatched and weakly monitored. When you treat asset awareness as a security control, you begin to understand why continuous vulnerability management starts with knowing what you actually have. Another important beginner concept is that vulnerability management is not just about production systems, because test, development, and support environments can become stepping stones. In many real incidents, attackers compromise a less protected environment and then move toward more sensitive targets by abusing shared credentials, shared networks, or shared management systems. If a development system has the same access to shared services as production, or if a support tool has broad reach into the payment environment, vulnerabilities in those places can impact the CD, even if those systems do not store the primary account number, PAN, directly. This is why blind spots are dangerous. They are often not inside the most protected zone, but adjacent to it in places teams assume are low risk. A continuous approach includes evaluating the relationships between environments, not just scanning a single segment and calling it done. Beginners often want a simple boundary that separates safe from unsafe, but real environments have many seams, and seams are where vulnerabilities are most likely to be exploited. When you include non-production and supporting systems in your thinking, your vulnerability management becomes more realistic and less fragile. Discovery is the first operational phase, and while it often involves scanning, the deeper point is that you must have a method for finding weaknesses across all relevant components. Discovery includes identifying software versions, configurations, and exposures that are known to be risky, and it also includes recognizing when a system's design creates a vulnerability even if it is fully patched. For example, a system that is reachable from many places with weak access controls may be vulnerable in practice because its exposure makes exploitation easier. Beginners sometimes treat discovery as a single tool output, but discovery is really a process of collecting evidence about the environment's weakness surface. It also includes understanding external versus internal exposures, because a vulnerability on an internet-facing system can have a very different urgency than the same vulnerability on a tightly isolated system. In a PCI environment, you care especially about vulnerabilities that provide pathways toward the CDE, whether directly or through connected to and could impact systems. When discovery is thorough, it prevents the false comfort that comes from checking only the obvious systems and missing the quiet ones. Prioritization is where vulnerability management becomes decision-making rather than busy work, and beginners often struggle here because a list of findings can feel overwhelming. Not all vulnerabilities are equal in risk, and the goal is to focus effort where it reduces the most danger. Prioritization considers factors like how exposed the affected system is, how critical the system is to payment processing, how easily the vulnerability can be exploited, and what the potential impact would be if exploitation occurs. It also considers whether the vulnerability enables movement, such as privilege escalation or remote access, because movement vulnerabilities can be especially dangerous near the CDE. Beginners sometimes rely only on severity labels, but severity labels are only part of the picture because context matters. A moderate issue on an internet-facing component might be more urgent than a high-severity issue on a system that is truly isolated and tightly controlled, though both should be addressed. When you learn to prioritize based on exposure and impact, you move from being reactive to being strategic, which is exactly what continuous vulnerability management demands. Remediation is the phase most people think of first, but it is also the phase where blind spots can reappear if the environment is not disciplined. Remediation may include applying patches, updating software, changing configurations, removing unnecessary services, tightening access, or redesigning a risky integration. The key point for beginners is that remediation is not complete when a change is made. It is complete when you have evidence that the vulnerability is no longer present or no longer exploitable in the relevant context. Without verification, teams can mistakenly believe they fixed something when they only reduced a symptom, or they can introduce new weaknesses while solving one. Remediation also needs to be coordinated with operational realities, because changes can affect availability, especially in payment systems where downtime is costly. This is why continuous vulnerability management depends on having predictable change practices and clear ownership, so remediation does not stall due to uncertainty. When remediation is treated as a verified outcome rather than a hopeful action, the cycle becomes trustworthy. Verification and reevaluation are often what separate continuous vulnerability management from occasional scanning, because they turn the practice into a feedback loop. Verification means you confirm that the vulnerability is addressed, and reevaluation means you check whether new vulnerabilities have appeared due to updates, new deployments, or changes in exposure. In fast-changing environments, this loop must run frequently enough to keep up with reality, because vulnerabilities can appear quickly when new software is deployed or when new internet exposure is introduced. Beginners sometimes think vulnerability management is a linear project, like finish the list and move on, but the list never stays finished because new weaknesses are discovered and new systems appear. A continuous practice accepts that and treats it as normal, building routines that keep the cycle moving without becoming chaotic. In a PCI context, reevaluation is also essential because compliance expects ongoing maintenance, not a snapshot. When you build verification into the process, you reduce the risk of drifting into a false sense of security. Blind spots often come from ownership gaps, where it is unclear who is responsible for scanning, who is responsible for fixing, and who is responsible for approving changes. In shared responsibility environments, blind spots can also come from assuming a service provider is covering something when they are not, or from failing to obtain evidence about provider-managed systems that can impact the CDE. Beginners sometimes assume vulnerability management is a purely technical process, but in reality, it is an organizational process because it requires coordination across teams. Clear role assignment matters, because a vulnerability that sits unfixed due to confusion is still a vulnerability. It also matters because assessment and evidence require you to show that vulnerabilities are tracked through a consistent workflow rather than handled randomly. A disciplined approach defines how findings are assigned, how deadlines are set, how exceptions are justified, and how verification is recorded, even if you do not describe those mechanisms as a formal workflow in the moment. When responsibilities are clear, blind spots shrink because fewer issues fall through cracks. Another common source of blind spots is misunderstanding exposure, especially when networks and architectures are more complex than beginners expect. A system might appear internal but still be reachable through remote access pathways, service provider connections, or misconfigured segmentation that creates unexpected routes. A component might be behind a front-end system but still exposed through management interfaces or through lateral movement from other compromised systems. This is why vulnerability management must be connected to network segmentation validation and to data flow mapping, because those activities reveal where connectivity exists and where it should not exist. If segmentation is weaker than assumed, vulnerabilities outside the CDE can become CDE risks because movement becomes easier. If data flows go through systems you forgot, vulnerabilities there can become direct exposure risks for sensitive information. Beginners sometimes treat these topics as separate chapters, but in practice they are connected. Vulnerability risk depends on connectivity, and connectivity is shaped by segmentation and design. When you understand these connections, you prioritize vulnerabilities more intelligently and reduce blind spots caused by incorrect assumptions about isolation. It is also important to address the beginner misconception that vulnerability management is only about known software flaws, because configuration issues and weak practices can be vulnerabilities too. Default credentials, overly permissive access, unnecessary services, and weak authentication settings can create exploitable conditions even if the system is fully patched. In payment environments, these conditions matter because attackers often chain small weaknesses to reach sensitive systems, and misconfigurations can provide easier paths than technical exploits. Continuous vulnerability management, therefore, includes secure baselines, drift control, and periodic checks that the environment still matches its intended secure state. If baseline enforcement is weak, then vulnerabilities can reappear even after you patch, because the environment's configuration becomes inconsistent. Beginners sometimes believe that patching is the entire solution, but patching is only one tool in the remediation toolbox. When you treat configuration and exposure as part of vulnerability management, you build a posture that is less dependent on a single mechanism. Service providers also shape vulnerability management, because a provider may operate infrastructure or platforms that affect your payment environment, and their vulnerabilities can become your vulnerabilities in practice. Shared responsibility means you need clarity about what the provider scans, what they patch, what they notify you about, and what evidence they provide. It also means you must manage vulnerabilities in the parts you control, especially your configurations and your integrations with the provider. Beginners sometimes assume providers are perfect at patching because they are specialized, but the real issue is not perfection. It is visibility and accountability. If you do not know what is being managed, you cannot defend that it is being managed well. Continuous vulnerability management, therefore, includes vendor governance that ensures coverage is complete, that timelines make sense for the risk, and that communication is clear when urgent issues arise. When provider coverage is explicit and verified, blind spots across boundaries become less likely. Finally, continuous vulnerability management requires a mindset that treats security as ongoing maintenance rather than occasional cleanup, and that mindset depends on accepting that new vulnerabilities will keep appearing. Software changes, attackers adapt, and business needs introduce new components and new exposures. So the job is never permanently finished. The goal is not to eliminate every weakness forever, but to reduce exposure and shorten the time vulnerabilities remain exploitable, especially in and around the CDE. That is why continuity matters. Frequent discovery, intelligent prioritization, verified remediation, and ongoing rechecking. Beginners sometimes feel discouraged by this, but it becomes easier when you see it as a routine like maintaining a vehicle, where you do regular checks to avoid breakdowns rather than waiting for the engine to fail. In PCI terms, this routine is also evidence that the environment is governed and maintained in a way that keeps the payment system trustworthy. When you treat vulnerability management as a living cycle, you are building resilience rather than chasing perfection. By the end of this lesson, the key takeaway is that running vulnerability management continuously without blind spots depends on discipline and knowing what you have, understanding exposure paths, and maintaining a repeatable cycle of discovery, prioritization, remediation, and verification. You include all relevant environments, not just the obvious production systems, because attackers often exploit the forgotten corners and the seams between zones. You prioritize based on context, especially proximity and pathways to the CDE, and you treat remediation as complete only when verified, not when merely attempted. You reduce blind spots by clarifying ownership and by governing service provider responsibilities so shared environments do not become invisible. When these practices operate steadily, vulnerabilities stop being a chaotic flood and become manageable signals that guide maintenance. And that steadiness is what protects cardholder data over time and what PCI expects from a mature, defensible security program.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.